Anybody who knows me knows that I'm a big outdoors guy. I'm a big water sport guy. Krista and I own kayaks. We own a canoe. Pretty soon we are going to own paddle boards. I'm really excited about this project, and here's the deal. I'm working with a Jarvis board kit. And what's neat about this is that they have done the hard part, which is design this so that it's actually going to work. I'm going to do the woodworking part, which is put the kit components together, and then put strips on here in order to turn what you see here into a paddleboard. So what's neat about this is there's a lot of room for creativity. I can change species here so that I get contrast. The woodworking is not difficult. It's just finessey. You got to pay attention to what you're doing. So in this video, it's not about giving you how-to steps, because Jarvis does a really good job of that. What I want to look at is, what does it take for a woodworker like me to put together a paddleboard? What's the accessibility level of this so that you can do this in your shop too? Now, this is a big project. There's a lot going on. And as a result, for this video, we have a lot of people involved. So, for instance, we have Bessie Clamp working with us. You're going to see as we put this project together, it's pretty clamp intensive. When we're putting the strips on, when we're putting the rails on the outside, we are going to use clamps and glue over and over and over and over again. We've got surf prep involved. They're going to come into play after we've shaped the board and we have to sand all the wood down to a good surface. And once the fiberglassing is done, that's going to involve sanding as well. Bridge City Tools and their planes. These are amazing products. And one of the really fun things about this project is that you're going to create a fair curve, and we're going to do a lot of that using those hand tools, using the planes, in order to get nice smooth curves into the paddleboard prior to that sanding step. Now, as we're doing all this work, we're going to create some dust. So Grizzly is involved, and they're going to help us keep our lungs clean. We've got a Grizzly air cleaner set up so that as we're producing dust, it's going to grab that dust for us. We have a SawStop CTS saw, and you're going to see a lot of ripping happening here. We need some 3/16 strips. We need some 1/4 inch thick strips. All of our cedar is going to get pushed through that CTS saw. And of course, what's nice there is we've got the SawStop brake technology involved. Once we get everything cleaned up, sanded, ready for the next step, we are going to be ready for Total Boat. We're using Total Boat products in order to seal the board first, then over that sealer, we'll apply fiberglass mesh and epoxy in order to make sure this is a completely watertight surface. The very last step, we want to make sure that the epoxy itself is protected. So Fuji is involved so that we can spray a nice coat over the top of those epoxy products to make sure that they're UV protected. All in all, like I said, big project, a lot of different people involved, and I can't wait to get moving forward with this. First step, we are going to meet Eric from Jarvis Boards and hear about his love for this whole thing. I am so lucky to have Eric from Jarvis in my shop today. So we're going to meet Eric, and then as we go through the day, he's going to also help me work on a paddleboard. So thanks for coming.
Of course.
And first thing is, let's hear a little bit about your love for paddleboards. How did you get here to be the owner of Jarvis Boards?
Yeah. So Jarvis Boards, I took the company over about 2 years ago. At that point in my life, I was kind of in this transition from my corporate desk job to wanting to use my hands again. I had a custom furniture shop in Chicago, and this company I'd been following makes these really cool DIY kits. And so I'd been a follower and fan of Jarvis Boards.
Because you were a paddleboarder already, it's like kind of coincidentally, yeah. You already had a love for this.
I did, yeah. So I grew up in small town Wisconsin. There's a million lakes. I grew up 15 minutes from Lake Michigan, always out on the water in the summer. And then this company came up for sale, and I was really excited about the opportunity because it kind of overlaps my enjoyment for being out on the water, my love for woodworking, and just helping other people bring their creations to life. It just kind of matched everything that I enjoy.
And I really like that aspect because you're not, I don't know, you're not just a corporate type trying to sell paddleboard kits. you've got the woodworking understanding that means you want to make sure woodworkers can work with this stuff. So you've got that real world part of woodworking that you're rolling into the accessibility of the kits.
Absolutely.
Now, the one that I'm working on, this is 11'4", but this is one of a selection of kits that you have available, right?
Correct. Yeah, this is our most popular model. This is our 11'4" all-around paddleboard. It's your traditional stand-up paddleboard that you see. It's got this rounded nose, basically looks like a giant surfboard. We have multiple models, different sizes of this, as well as what's called a touring paddleboard, and that has more of a pointed nose. It's a little bit narrower. It's a little less stable, but you can go much faster because of that displacement hull.
And the other thing we were talking about a little bit ago that I think is crazy cool is if somebody comes to you and they're like, well, I don't like paddleboard A, B, or C. This is what I want to do. You're fully set up to design whatever they want. So maybe that's if you're a large person who needs a bigger board or whatever those needs are, you can custom design a kit for them.
Exactly, and that includes outside of just paddle boards. What I've been working on too is expanding into surfboards and wakeboards, and basically the internal structure is the same. It's just these center spine, these rib pieces, and the side rails, but I can design any water board sport you can imagine, and we can turn it into a kit.
So bottom line, if the water thing you want ends in the word board, you can help them with that.
Pretty much.
All right, so what we're looking at now is not, this didn't just magically appear. A few steps happened before this. So next thing we're gonna do is turn the clock back a little bit and look at what it took to get to this point. For my paddle boards, what I want to do is go with a strip approach, which is going to be from the center, work out with strip after strip after strip to cover this. So I'm choosing to use cedar from that. So just first off, in technique, Eric, another approach would be instead of applying the strips here, a person could make a panel off the paddle board and put the whole panel on, right?
Yep.
Okay, so if you're going to go in this direction or with a panel, cedar for me, what are other good material choices?
Yeah, I would say, to your point, most people choose cedar. It's pretty well accessible and it's really lightweight and it's beautiful once you fiberglass it. An alternative would be just standard pine. I've seen people make these things out of 2x4s from their local store. There also is a wood called Paulownia that's a little lesser known. It's very strong, but it's very lightweight. And it also is a great alternative if you can get your hands on some.
So for me, one of the things I recognized is that I wanted to make sure I got good quality cedar. So I did my shopping not at a home center, but I went to more of a ma and pa kind of a lumberyard, and recognizing I'm looking for cedar 2x6s. The clearer, the better. Yeah. If, as I start ripping this into strips, knots are going to fall out. We can work with that, but it's harder to work with. So step one was loading those up at the lumberyard. Step two was bringing them into the shop. One of the things I think it's important for people to recognize on the material side of this is that yes, cedar has natural weather resistance, but at the end of the day, we're going to envelop this whole thing in epoxy.
Right.
So it's really, the epoxy is what creates the waterproof shell. We don't need to lean on wood characteristics for that, right, which is why pine can work. All right, so then where we were at is, in this case, 11'4" for my paddleboard. So you got to have a 12-foot long table to put these forms on. So one approach, the approach I took for this was to make a strong back. And the strong back is this box down here. For me, I got everything out of one 5/8 inch thick, 4x8 sheet of plywood. That I did get from a home center. It's just construction grade plywood. And as I put it together, I used a stapler and glue in order to get everything built out into one 12-foot long continuous straw back. Now, one of your ideas that I stole that I really, really like is these pillars down here. So for you, because you're neck deep in all this stuff, once people have the strong back and they're looking for a way to set this up, let's go other options first. What else can people do?
Yeah, I mean, you can simply just lay them across a couple sawhorses if you don't have if you don't want to do the concrete bucket route, and that's probably the most common way to do it.
Okay. So for me, what I really liked about the bucket idea is that as I'm working around the paddleboard, nothing is sticking out that I'm going to run into. And remember, we've still got a lot of steps to go. We're going to end up sanding, planing, fiberglassing. So when those steps happen, I think your recommendation on this was we take the strong back off,
Yep.
and we still use those columns coming out of the buckets
Exactly.
to put the board on. So I love the dipping, the double dipping like that. And then two, this is very easy to move. If I need to slide this whole thing around my shop, yes, it's concrete, but I can move this all by myself. So I love that poured concrete concept.
Yeah.
Now, that gets us to a point where we had the strong back, we had the pillars, we had the concrete. One of the cool things about your kit is it comes in a box. It's like this, not quite, but you make it shippable by having these individually laser cut components in a box. So even the long outside rails, the long center spine are broken down into small components that fit in like a 4 foot long or so cardboard box. So the next step for me was getting the parts assembled enough that I could get the layout on the strong back. So there are a couple steps to that. I used a string on the strong back. We want that spine to be straight, straight, straight. So a string never lies. So I started with the string. From the string, I drew lines on the strong back. That got me a line end to end. Then I put the center spine on there, and I could strike lines from the spine indicating where each individual rib has to go. That got me to a point where I could start getting the frame on here, which is crazy cool because now it's starting to look like a paddleboard. Now you see what you're doing. And one of the things that was neat about that is I was able to clamp across from rail to rail, and the Total Boat Thixo provided a really good solution to what I was trying to do here, which was I just clamped everything together, made sure it was right, and then I went back corner by corner by corner and applied that Thixo on the inside corners to reinforce the whole concept. And that really leaves it as one solid structure. And so many people have said you're building an airplane wing, which is kind of the same concept. In woodworking, we would call this a torsion box. It's we have this internal frame, we're gluing the skins over the top. So when it's done, it's crazy strong. It's really cool. All right, so leading up to where we are right now, anything else from your experience with putting these together that would help folks out?
I think maybe one thing is just hot glue is really good for getting those tabs down on the table. It's just like really easy to quickly set them, and you can have this whole frame pretty much set up before you do the Thixo in really short time. Yeah,
that's an important step. So we are to a point, finally, a really exciting point where we can start putting strips on. To put strips on, I'm going to make Eric help me cut some strips. A little bit challenging. We're going to rip 12-foot long 2x4, 2x6s. So next thing, we're going to head for the table saw and make strips and dust.
Let's do it.
I'm done jabbering and we get to finally do some woodworking. So one of the things, let's talk about cutting these strips, because two different dimensions, right, that we're working with?
Yep, so it's important to note when you set up your kit, you're actually looking at the bottom side of your board. And because you're not going to be standing on that side, you can actually go a little bit thinner with your strips. So I like to do 3/16 of an inch on the bottom and 1/4 inch on the top. And you'd be surprised that 16th inch across the entire board really does add quite a bit of weight. So it's
it's weird. It's a little number, but it's 25%.
Right.
So yeah, that makes sense. We've got our cedar ready to go. And one of the things I want to mention too is like, you'll see as we move through this, I'm going to use cedar and I'm going to use other material as well, because that color contrast is a cool part of this. So as a woodworker, one of the things I really like is that creative side, like, all right, I know cedar is this color. What if I add some walnuts, some maple, some bloodwood, which I am going to add. So thinking about that as you get into the kit is a good way to personalize it and make it your own. 12-foot long stuff. So in-feed and out-feed support is important. And you've got a great hack, a paddleboard hack.
Yeah. So another great use of the strong back is if you don't have the in-feed, out-feed, you can actually use that strong back that you built. Just make sure you cut your strips before you glue your frame to the strong
and in
back.
the normal sequence, not doing a video, the strong back would still be sitting here with nothing on it.
Exactly.
Most of the time. So in my case, I'm using sawhorses in and out. We're going to do our cutting on the saw stop. So of course, cool aspect of this is the brake technology. The other cool aspect is that we're cutting narrow stuff. And I really like leaving the guard in place. So with this saw, we can do this. And with that step in the fence, I can set this so that it's right for my narrow strips. Get in the right spot. But it leaves the guard over the blade. The other thing, we are going to make some dust, even with, we've got dust collection on the saw. So this is a good time when we're going to kick in our Grizzly air cleaner in order to grab some of this airborne stuff so that we don't grab the airborne stuff. You think we're ready?
I think so.
All right, as ready as we're going to be. So let's make ripping happen. So Eric, one of the things, so with the cedar I got, I found it to be pretty useful in that like pretty much every strip I cut I could use, but would you say people got to anticipate maybe 10% waste in their strips, or how should you play that?
I think it depends on the lumber source you've got, but yeah, if you find a piece of board and it's got quite a few knots, you're going to have a good 10% waste that you should be aware of.
One of the things that made me think of it, on that last one we cut, it kind of popped a little bit as we were cutting it. Mm-hmm. It could have a weak spot, a big knot right in the middle. And when you're trying to span 12 feet, maybe that's not going to work. Right. It might work toward the outer edge, but you're not going to be able to use it in the middle. So you got to anticipate that a little. But one of the things I love about your boards is these 3 2x6s are going to do everything.
Yeah.
So the material requirements aren't that significant to make your paddleboard.
Right.
Well, we have got a lot more ripping to do so that we have enough strips for the paddleboard, and then I'm going to make you help me put strips on. I know there's a better way to do it than what I was doing. So we'll rip some more strips, and then we will convene back at the paddleboard. This is going to be fun. So if we do a little turn in the clock back again, we talked about the whole concept of getting the ribs and the spine onto the strong back. And then your recommendation is get 1 strip down the center and work out. So prior to everybody getting here, I got that 1 strip on. Now for me, on the other board, when I worked by myself, I did 1 strip, walked away, 1 strip, walk away being let the glue dry.
Yep.
Then come and do another one. And I love one of your tips on your video was do the strips on a day when you kind of have other stuff to do. Like, so you could put a strip on, run to the grocery store, put a strip on, go let the dog out, put a strip on, because you need some glue cure time.
Yeah.
We want that strip to be solidly in place before we start to work on the next one.
Yes, you're going to be repeating yourself a lot in this strip laying process, so it's nice to have some things to do while the glue's drying.
And then riddle me this, Batman. You've done a lot of these. Do you do more than 1 strip at a time normally?
Yeah, I always say for the first couple, just do 1 at a time, but you'll quickly get the hang of it, and you can do 2 at a time, and that'll twice the speed up.
And I would say, so experientially for me, if you can have another pair of hands in the shop, it'd be good. Because again, we're on 3/16 inch strips here, thick. So we want to have flushicity across the top. If that gets away from you someplace, then you're gonna have to do a lot of sanding, and you might leave that way thinner than you want it to be when you're done. So if you do the multiple strip thing, I think having somebody to help you, see how I did that, is a good idea to make sure that everything comes out right. And net, our goal is glue down and glue edge to edge.
Yep.
All right. So one of the ways I did this was I laid the strip there, and then I grabbed a felt tip, and I want to know on the horizontals, on the ribs, how far to apply my glue so I don't have a metric boatload of squeeze out over here. So with the felt tip, I just traced. And two, this is a time, right, for people to be looking at these strips and say like, ooh, that came out so dog leg. Like, how much of a bow are you comfortable telling people it's okay to push against? Like as a woodworker, I always say, you want to have a good joint inherently.
Yep.
You don't want to force clamps to close it. Would that rule stick here?
Yeah, same rules apply. I mean, it's not going to be clamped super tight, but you should be able to get like finger pressure, and you can see that closes up nice.
Okay. Yeah, so anything that pops off your saw looking like a rocking chair, don't use it here. I'm going with Tite Bond 3. It's a waterproof glue, but again, in the big scheme of things, we're gonna encase this whole thing in fiberglass. So waterproof is nice, but not imperative, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's nice to have the fiberglass and the epoxy. You're gonna do the majority of that.
And you actually dig polyurethane glue as well, because, or tell us why.
Yeah, so the polyurethane glue has some expansive properties. So if you do have a little bit of a
it costs
gap,
a lot? Oh no, that's expensive. Okay, never mind.
so yeah, it does have it expands and can fill gaps a little bit. So if you don't have this perfect clamp, that foam or that glue is going to expand into a foam and fill those gaps, which is helpful.
And two, on these edges, we were just talking about this, like these are construction grade 2x6s. So if the faces of those 2x6s, which are now the edges that we're mating up here, if those faces weren't really, really flat and really, really clean, when you go to close this, they may not, which is another spot where the gap filling is going to be important because it'll help compensate for that. Yep. All right, well, let's throw a bunch of glue on and then we'll clamp it, Judd.
Let's do it.
All right, do you care? So for me, I started in the center and then worked out. Does that jive with your thinking?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And making sure that I have enough that way, because that would be a shame to get everything in clamps.
Yep.
So right here is a part, in my experience, than the other one. You want to be careful with, because if you just come here and clamp, it kind of forces this up. So my point with this being, work your way down toward from here to here to make sure this is even, then this is even, then this is even. Couple more.
Pretty much there.
And that leaves us like half done, right?
Yep.
Because we're squoze, but we're not pushed.
Exactly.
All right. A little vertical pressure. And then you were talking before we started this about the tap test, which is what?
Yeah, so some of these will just lay down really firm just with the horizontal clamping, and to check that it's all the way down too, you could just tap on it. If you hear it, and there's some space in between there.
If it like rattles.
If it rattles
you're
a little
not
bit,
down.
then it's a good place to throw in one of these spring clamps or the C-clamp.
All right, you happy with this?
Looks great, yeah.
All right, so one of the questions is, these are 12-foot long boards. If we don't have 12-foot stuff, that's not a deal breaker. We can still make a 12-foot paddleboard
Right.
with scarfing.
Correct.
So we're going to look at scarfing. It's a cool word. We're going to look at scarfing next. To create a scarf joint, what we need is a really steep angle like this in both parts. And when I've got that on the end of both pieces, we can overlap them and glue them together, and it's surprisingly strong. So the way I'm going to start is by making a block, cut at a steep angle, and I'm going to get all of this clamped in place. And then, got a little too much sticking out. There we go. What I'm eyeballing here is that angle's got to go down and end up at or slightly behind that corner. And then a great tool for this is one of the Bridge City low angle planes. I'm using a block plane, and all we need to do is just keep whittling away. And with the low angle, that's important because of the way that we're shearing across that end grain. And then as I get close, eventually it's going to get to where the plane is on here, and I'm shooting this angle onto that board. So I just stop, watch. And that's about it. When that's a straight line from there across there, your scarf joint is done being cut, and then we can look at gluing that together. To put this together, have some wax paper on your bench. It would be a shame to glue the board down to your bench top. little bit of glue, same stuff that we used on the strips. And then put the scarves together. Now, one of the things you want to do is make sure this is running in a straight line. So I'm gonna put a straight edge on there, chuck that, and then just clamp over the top. Done. Now I've got one here that I did previously. Same material, it's that same mahogany. It's scarfed right there. And this is what you end up with, which is pretty crazy cool. I turned 6-foot boards into a 12-foot board with a scarf in the middle. So this is pretty cool. We're setting the paddleboard free. There's these little pillars under there that stick beyond the form, and that's what they're supposed to do, their legs. So we're cutting just above the strong back. I feel like I'm in a lumberjack contest with Eric over here. And then once they're all free, we'll flip this over.
Lift off.
That's already looking so cool. Because you don't get to see this cool curve when it's upside down. So that's, what a neat moment right there. So now we have a couple things. We're gonna trim all of these off so that we get rid of those and we have that shape. And we're gonna do this trim, and Eric's got a good point, which is it's best to do this when you can look at it so that you know you're not gonna hit your outside shape there. And then we just gotta get close because it's finished with a flush trim out of it, right? So for that, if we just leave 1/8 to 1/4 beyond the form, a flush trim bit is gonna take care of the rest of that. Bunch more of that, and then we got to clean up the strong back because we're going to use that as a work surface, right? So we got some cutting to do, and then we'll be back. So I think you're ready to foam home. So these accessories that's what's going to receive the fin on the bottom when we're to that point. This is going to be a handle so that you can carry it, and then you've got that breather thing, which is crazy cool. And then that's a strap to put onto your ankle. So, but with all of this stuff, when it's just the 1/4-inch skin, the bottom line here is you can't rely on just the 1/4-inch skin. So I'm a little surprised the foam is the solution, but that's a cool solution, like to give you some body to this thing.
Yeah, the accessories need something to grab onto when you insert them. And the foam is just a super, basically weightless option. You definitely, if you want the board to be completely wood, you could just use some of your scrap cedar that you used. It just adds a little bit of weight that you'll never really see.
But also we're gonna use a router to recess this later. So routing foam is a whole lot easier than routing a wooden block. And it's important for people to know this is not flotation. This is it just is coincidentally foam, but it's what gives us the support for this. So let's hit that handle spot first. And one of the things that happened was we, by which I mean Eric, grabbed the board and found center of gravity. So it was like pocket number 9 is where you had happiness, right?
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is like holding the board, it wasn't nose heavy or tail heavy, it balanced well. So that's where we know those need to go. So doctor, clamp. Oh, you got the clamps.
Got them over here. Yeah, so those will go in right there. Oh, I'm gonna add a little of this Thixo.
Whatever you want me to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we can actually probably add it to the frame.
I'm gonna just stick here just because I'm lazy and it's easier.
Yeah.
So this is another good application for this Thixo product. Epoxy that's mixing in the tip as we go. And then across the top and the bottom as well?
Yeah.
And then just like any two-part epoxy, that's going to cure and hold that in place.
Yeah. So.
Got it on your fingers yet?
Not yet.
Oh, I should probably be doing this block while you're doing that.
Looks pretty good. And you can leave the foam over the frame a little bit because you'll sand that flush later anyways. All right, that one's in.
As you're moving forward, you're going to come back with sandpaper and knock any little nubs off. Then the other thing we'll need to do is sand the foam so it's flush with the top of the frame. And then this starts looking like the other side. One strip down the middle, and then start working out. I'm excited about this. I've got curly maple that I'm going to use on the top. And when the fiberglass hits that curly maple, it's going to look really cool. Not exclusively curly maple, in addition to the cedar. We're going to take advantage of drying time on this to head back for the other board and show you a couple things over there once we have this. Second verse, same as the first, and then like 5th, 13th, 18th verse, same as the first. Put another strip on, but wanted to use this opportunity to talk again about the contrast here. This is mahogany, this is cedar. One of the neat aspects of doing this is creating your own custom look. So there'll end up being a handful of different colors involved with this board, top and bottom, and you'll really see them pop. You'll really see the contrast once the fiberglass hits. So at this point, we got a lot of strips to go. Got to finish this whole bottom. Doesn't that paddleboard look cool? I have got strips on both the top and the bottom of the board. And what I'm doing at this second is just a preliminary sanding. What I really want to do is knock the glue beads down so that those high spots are gone. I'm not concerned yet about finish sanding. Now, a couple things as the board comes together. One, remember with those internal frame components, we had one part that was crowned over the top and then it's meeting the rail on the side. So one of the things that you have to do as you're getting ready to put these top strips on is you have to get the angles to meet. So the easiest way to do that is lay a strip across the ribs, and then as you bring that down to the rail, you can see that it's interrupted by the rail. It can't go over the top of it because the top of the rail is still square. The easiest way to correct that is use a block plane. This little Bridge City block plane is amazing. Use a block plane to knock that angle down and get the bevel on that rail to match the curve on the ribs. So now the strips can smoothly make that transition and come over the top and over the top of the rail. The other thing you may have found is what I have here, which is if there are spots where the strips didn't quite come together, don't sweat it, but fix that now. Fix is, as you're sanding, save some sawdust, grab your glue, and the sawdust is very fine. So what we're gonna do is mix up just a little wood dough. And what's nice about this approach, rather than using wood dough, commercial wood dough, is that because this dust came from this project, we know it's gonna match. So dump some of that same Type On 3 in there. That's still a little too thick. It's not bad. Then use a putty knife, pack that in. And the benefit to doing this now is we still have some more sanding to go. So as we do our subsequent sanding steps, you're gonna clean up this little bit. I'm gonna give this, I don't know, it's only gonna take 5 or 10 minutes to dry, and then come back and buzz the sander over this again so that you can see just how effective this is at filling in these spots. Even right there, there's a little crack in that knot, there's a little crack in that knot. I'm giving some attention to those as well. Screed that off the top. So I'll give that a few minutes, 5, 10 minutes to dry. We'll come back and sand that section so you can see just how effective that is at filling those tiny voids. The before and after on that is pretty significant. That split, that openness in the seams was right there, and now it's completely invisible. Outside of paddle boards, that sawdust and glue trick is a great thing to remember. The other thing that's important is I've got good dust collection on the sander. In addition to that, I'm running the Grizzly air cleaner throughout this process to make sure that any airborne stuff I do get is going there, not there. Now, the other thing that happened before you got here is strips top and bottom got trimmed flush to the rails and then sanded so that when I do this, which is now simulating the external rail I'm going to add, I know that I've got a straight line from top to rail to bottom so that those rails have a good glue surface. There's a little bit of a gap between the strips and the form rails, and I'm not worried about that because now when I put the exterior rails on, I'm going to be bridging all of that, and those are going to tie everything together just fine. For these rails to go on here, they've got to make this bend, and the bend doesn't look like much, but it's pretty dramatic. So just putting a piece of 3/4 inch cedar on here isn't going to work, and you don't want to add that kind of weight. What we're going to do is make 2 1/4 inch strips per side. The 1/4 inch will easily make the bend. Adding a 1/2 inch of cedar on here is going to give us good protection with this outside rail, but not add a boatload of weight to the paddleboard, and that's important. So next step is from here to the table saw so we can do a little bit of resawing. To make our 1/4 inch rails, we're going to do that here at the table saw. This is a process called resawing. So the way we do that here is we've got a 5.5 inch wide board and about a 3 inch capacity on the table saw. This is going to take 2 cuts. I'm going to push through, flip the whole board end for end, go again, and the distance between the blade and the fence is what's set for my final size. I'm a little bit over. I'm actually cutting it about 5/16. because then you'll want to clean up the saw marks on that, and that'll get us closer to that final 1/4 inch when we're done. Other thing here is, again, dust collection between the vac on the saw, the Grizzly air cleaner, and listen to the tool, let it do the work, and make the cut. That gives us one of those. Pretty cool. For the height of your saw blade, set that a little more than half the width of what you're cutting. So in this case, it's a 5.5 inch wide 2x6. So my blade is set just a little beyond 2 3/4 inch so that the cuts overlap just a little in the middle. Clean up those saw marks. You can do that with your sander. And then that rail is going to be ready to get glued on your paddleboard. Big picture, here's where I'm at. I've got that preliminary sanding done top and bottom. So the glue beads are off. I'm going to come back and do some more cleanup work on all that stuff. And again, these sides have been prepped to where we know everything is in plane here. Now, with the rail, you saw me cut from a really wide piece of cedar what looks like a really narrow rail for this, but you got to not get tricked by this. When you look at the paddleboard right here, it looks like, geez, I only need a, whatever, 3 1/4 inch wide piece. But if we look at the boat in general, if I put this level on here and you can see from the center here, the uplift that's happening toward the nose and the uplift that's happening toward the tail. So what that means is you need a much wider piece to make the rails than it appears from just looking at the sides. So make sure on your paddleboard you double check that before you resaw your piece. Then what I did is I laid that cedar on here and I traced it and I did a preliminary cut, leaving it oversized. So that's going to do a couple things. Eventually this has got to get trimmed to this. So now there's less material there. It's going to be a great application for a hand plane. The other thing it does is it's going to make it easier to make the bend because now we're working with less material. And then same with, you know, talking about the width of this piece. I can bend this cedar easily this way. But don't think that you can bend it this way to force it to follow the nose and the tail. It's not going to want to bend parallel to the grain. It's going to want to bend down like this. So that leaves me in a position of glue, 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 spread, 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 clamp, clamp, clamp. When this goes on, before I clamp it, I'm just double checking, do I have enough on this end to get down there? Do I have enough on this end? It looks pretty good. And then I have a little overhang on each side, so I'm splitting the difference. And then before you do any more clamping, what I have learned is do a double check, which is this gonna just naturally lay down and cover? And then this one is not. So what we don't wanna do is clamp, 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 and then try to force this over with this already in position, because it's gonna kind of buckle that side rail. But if I do this, if I cheat it over a little now, and I lay it down, that looks way better. And then same thing, I'm gonna do the same thing going this way. And that end looks good. So that tells me I'm centered all the way down. Just going again, yeah. That tells me I'm centered all the way down and I can start clamping. Not a bad place to have another pair of hands, because as you can see, that's quite the porcupine quill full of clamps that we've got on the paddleboard there. But you want to make sure that you get that rail pulled down so that you don't have gaps between the rail and the paddleboard. Now, here's what's going to happen. Give this plenty of time to dry. We're under some tension here. We're drawing that rail down. So give it plenty of time for curing on that glue. All the clamps come off, then I'm going to do it again. So I'm going to have 2 rails, 1/4 inch thick each on this side, 2 more on the other side. Once that's set, then we're going to be ready for the next step. Looks good. I love how this paddleboard is looking. Now let me catch you up with where I'm at here. I've got 2 layers of rails glued onto each side, like I talked about in the previous step. I've also got the nose and the tail blocks fastened on. Now, the way that works is you're gonna make a cut across there. Eric has really good how-to videos on how to handle that. And then I use the Total Boat Thick Sew in order to glue and then clamp this in place. So in my case, on this one, I'm using a lovely piece of lace wood. Once I had that cut done, I applied my Thick Sew on there. That 2-part epoxy is going to do a great job of securing these blocks. Clamped them on, let them cure. That leaves us ready for this next step, which is going to be very fun. This is starting to generate a shape. I'm going to do that with Bridge City hand planes. Now, on the rails, what we need to do is bring those down and not only flush them up with the top, but we've got this curve here. So in the end, we're gonna end up introducing a bevel here to match the shape of the top. And that's part of what's gonna be fun here, is working on that shaping component. And of course, with our cedar and a good quality plane, nice shavings coming off of there. So here's what this boils down to. I'm going to do a lot of this. I'll stop in a little bit and we'll have another look at the nose and the tail blocks and what's going to happen there, because we can also use the hand planes in order to get our shaping on those. So this is going to be fun. Going to generate some beautiful curls here. So there are a bunch of things going on here. Doing this with a hand plane is really rewarding. You saw those crazy cool curls that were coming off of this. That is very fun to see happen. Now, what I'm looking for here is I'm getting that rail that I put on, the two rails, to match the curve of the top. And part of that, in addition to laying it down this way, is to give it just a little bit of ease on this corner. You don't want to leave a sharp corner here. I want to knock that sharp corner off. The block plane is great for that. Now, once we're past this with the plane, then we're going to go back to the sander and get a good finish sand on everything. But also, let's look at the nose, because that is coming out so cool. My choice on this, like I said before, was lacewood. This is why. The finish off this plane is really, really nice. It's really starting to pop that grain. I've got a little bit more shaping to do here. I've got to match the direction of the top here and bring that out. And then the bottom is pretty much in line already. I got a little bit more work to do there, but then a little more rounding on the nose in general, just to make it look more like the nose of a paddleboard. But I'm really excited about this, and honestly, I can't wait to keep going with it and then see it under fiberglass. So marching orders are finish the planing, do finish sanding, and really the build part of this is about done. You saw me use a Bridge City plane to bring the rails down. Once I had the bulk of that done with the plane, then I grabbed my sander and I finessed that the rest of the way down, getting those rails perfectly flush with the top and with the bottom. I also used the sander to take down any big glue beads, any drips there were on these boards. Next thing is we're going to do some finessing here. You're probably going to find some spots where the strips are not quite flush across, they're not even. And that's just the nature of the way that the whole thing gets put together. So because they're not even, there's also some glue residue there. So we have two issues. The glue's got to come off and we got to get the strips even. The Bridge City scraper plane is really a great tool for this. With a scraper plane, there's a scraper iron in here instead of a plain iron. And what you'll see in a second is that this takes off just thousandths of an inch per pass. So it's a really good way to just finesse what we're doing now and remove tiny bits of material to kind of sneak up on getting these flush. So this is what's coming off of there. And you can see just from the delicacy or how delicate those shavings are, we're taking off just tiny, tiny bits of material. So that's great because it gives you really good control over making sure you don't take off more than you need to. The other thing that's nice with a scraper is that we're removing material, but we're not making dust. We're making shavings. So you're not getting any airborne stuff. And of course, with the surf prep system, that's very self-contained. It's got really good dust collection on the sander. If you don't have such great dust collection, scraper plane is also a great way to go because like I said, you get shavings instead of dust. So what I need to do is just keep working my way down the board and finessing these strips to get them even. Make sure there's no glue residue. I love that sound. It just sounds great. It's the sound of a really good cut. All right, more of that to do for me. The best way to check the quality of your sanding and planing work is to use a really powerful light set low so it's going to rake over the surface. This is what I'm doing with this Surf Prep LED. When you get down low and you look at the board with that light raking across it, it really shows any high spots or low spots you have. It's going to make it really easy to control the quality of what you're doing. And you can take advantage of this and use it again later when you're putting the epoxy and the varnish on. For the same reason, it's a great way to check your work. I'm probably going to say this about 1,000 times, but when you first start working with the epoxy, make sure you read and understand the directions. You want your environment to be right. That pertains to temperature and dust. And there's also very specific mixing instructions. I'm applying Total Boat's penetrating epoxy at this stage. And what it's going to do is it's going to soak into the material. And one huge advantage to this is it's going to prevent bubbles from being able to come through the other epoxy layers that we're going to do later. If you've ever used a sealer before a top coat on other woodworking projects, it's very similar to what the penetrating epoxy is accomplishing for us here. The penetrating epoxy is a very thin liquid. It spreads really easily. Moving this around with the squeegee is a great way to go. We just want a thin layer on here. We're not trying to get a build like we will later. After I had the squeegee work done, I went back with a brush. That was the easiest way for me to get penetrating epoxy on these side rails. I also used the brush to just kind of level out the work I had done with the squeegee. It's really important to know when to be done. You don't want to overwork this and end up leaving more marks than you're removing because the epoxy has started to cure. Then we'll just let that cure and we'll be ready to start building up the epoxy layers. This is a really big moment in my paddleboard build. What you see laying over the board is the fiberglass mat upon which I am about to pour epoxy. What's cool about this, and we saw a little bit of this with the penetrating epoxy, is when the wood gets wet with finish, in this case with epoxy, is when it really starts to pop. The curly maple is showing up, the walnut, cedar, bloodwood, all that contrast is really coming out. So here's the thing. There's lots of great information out there about how to do what we're about to do. Jarvis Boards has some great videos about it. So again, as I've been doing throughout this, this is really about how does this go for me? What do you need to be aware of? So you need to be aware of, read the directions on your product. It's very, very important to understand how to use this. Part of that is environmental. You want your environment to be at the right temperature. You gotta be careful about the humidity so that the epoxy reacts the way it's supposed to react. This is chemistry. Everything is there. Total Boat will be happy to tell you everything you need to know to be set up for this. Today, we haven't done woodworking in here because we don't want dust and stuff falling out of the air on top of the wet epoxy. There's some cure time here. The directions will tell you what the cure time is. So again, just environmentally, you want to be aware that you don't want a bunch of dust flying around when you do that. So I've been very careful about that. Leading up to this, you saw the penetrating epoxy get put on. Following that, what I did is I grabbed the Surf Prep sander, and any place where I had big obvious high spots like drips, I sanded those down. While I was doing that, I was running my Grizzly air filter to make sure that I was keeping the environment clear. And again, it's all about dust and not breathing it in and not leaving it in the air and all that stuff. That gets us about to a point where I can mix up epoxy and get going here. Before I do that, one of the things I want to talk about is this cool business with a decal with a logo that you can put onto your board. And I really got to thank Eric at Jarvis for this tip. I saw him doing this and I wasn't sure how he did it. So I asked. And the reason I'm putting a glove on is lesson learned. You don't want to touch the mat with just naked fingers because you can leave oil from your fingers on there and that might show up as a spot where the epoxy doesn't want to stick very well. So you'll see, I'm going to put this wave on the board. I love this. This is printed just from my regular laser printer on rice paper. That's the key to this. When the epoxy hits the rice paper and gets it wet, the paper part disappears and you're left with just the ink. So big thank you to my daughter Ginny for doing this drawing for me. The wave and the sun, I think it's very cool. It's going to actually end up under the mat. So we can do that part right now. The other thing that happened after sanding is The whole board got wiped down with denatured alcohol to make sure there wasn't any dust left on there. Now, kind of like, I don't know, unmaking a bed, I know that the mat's laying here just right, so I'm going to be a little bit careful about how I do this. And then this is going to get centered and up toward the nose. And then we can bring the mat back. And I'm watching it just to make sure that as I readjust, we don't lose position on that thing. That gets me in a position where I'm ready to mix epoxy. So again, follow the directions. I am using Total Boat's high performance epoxy on this with their slow hardener. It's a 2-to-1 mix. And again, follow their directions. So this gets about 3 minutes of mixing. I'm gonna dress my mat just a little bit more. And we're ready to go. Environmentally, one more thing. There's plastic on the floor. You're gonna get drips. And I don't mean me. You're gonna get epoxy drips coming off of the board. So you wanna have plastic down so you don't end up with that product all over your shop floor. Looks great. Love the logo. Thank you, Jenny. Love the working time I get from the Total Boat product. So now, all we got to do is watch it dry. And next couple steps, a little more epoxy work. We'll talk about that some more later. A few things have happened since the last time you saw a paddleboard here. The last thing that I did was put the fiberglass mat and the high performance epoxy onto the other paddleboard. This one is a step ahead of that. On top of the fiberglass mat, you then do a hot coat. And again, it's the Total Boat high performance epoxy. So when you look at this, this is why it looks so amazing, is because that high performance epoxy has been applied and it self-levels. And the board looks absolutely incredible. Now, the next thing we need to do is get a UV resistant varnish over the top of the epoxy. So leading up to this step, a couple things happened. You can see that the accessories are installed. So this is my handhold in the middle of the board. That's going to make it easier to pick up. On the back end of the board, there is an anchor so that you can tie onto the board so you don't lose it. And then there's also a vent that's very important so that the board can ventilate. It's very smart. It's a one-way vent, so it lets air out, does not let water in. When I installed those, they went in with Thixo. This is the same stuff you saw used when I put the whole frame together to hold the frame together. So what's amazing about this is it's epoxy. It's two-part epoxy. It mixes in the tip. And basically we're caulking and gluing these accessories in to make sure they're going to stay and make sure that they're waterproof once they're installed. So the Thixo worked really well for that. Now, with the epoxy by itself is not UV resistant. So the product that we're going to add to that is Gleam. That's a spar varnish that does have UV block to it. So that now goes over the top of everything that we've done. We're going to put that on with the Fuji HVLP sprayer. So gleam can be brushed. However, you can't beat the ease of finishing that we get from an HVLP like the Fuji system. We're almost ready for that, but in order to make that happen, we need to scuff this just a little bit. So with its high gloss that it has right now, yes, it looks amazing, but we want to give it just a little bit of tooth to make sure that the varnish is going to stick. So I'm going to grab the Surf Prep sandpaper, 320 grit, and I'm just going to lightly scuff the entire board before we get to the varnish step. So that's where I'm at right now. I love looking at it, but we got to knock this gloss down in order to get adhesion for that varnish. So I'm going to mask up. We're going to run the Grizzly air filter and let the scuffing begin. Well, I think I'm there. So when you look at it now, especially when I'm down here looking at it like this, you can tell that we've knocked that high gloss off of it, and that's what we want. We want to make sure that that varnish can adhere. So I think we're pretty close to being ready for varnish. With the scuffing done, the next thing I did is I masked off the accessories so that I don't end up with varnish all over those. Easy peasy. Let's talk about getting the gleam applied for a second. Like I said, you can brush that gleam on if you want to. I love using an HVLP anytime I'm doing finishing. It's such an easy way to get a great consistent coat on stuff. So what we've got here is a Fuji HVLP system. HVLP is high volume, low pressure. One of the big benefits to this is clean air coming from the turbine. So I'm using a turbine to provide the air, not an air compressor. And then also the ability to control how much air I'm providing so that I can correctly atomize whatever I'm spraying, whether it's varnish today, paint tomorrow, shellac the next day. So it works very well for that. And you'll see in a second, minimal overspray. So doing that spraying in the environment we're in is not going to be a problem. The other thing when it comes to finishing that's very beneficial is having a low high intensity light so that you can look at that light glancing across the surface and make sure you're doing an okay job. So I've got Surf Prep's LED set up just a little higher than the plane of the board. So I'll be able to get down and get funky. I'll be able to get down and look at the board as I'm going to make sure that I'm laying on a consistent coat of gleam. So I think we're ready to go. The other thing I'll mention is that after scuffing, before we got here, I also wiped the board down to make sure that there was no residual dust or anything left on it from the scuffing step. Read the instructions on the gleam can. You can want to build up multiple coats of varnish on the paddleboard or canoe or boat or whatever you're doing. So read the instructions about time between the next overcoat and the next coat and the next coat. So I am going to try to be patient and do a little waiting here. and then build up my coats just like I'm supposed to. The next thing, we're dangerously close to getting paddle boards on the water. It's a big day. It's time to take the paddleboard for a test drive. You can see how easy it is to handle the board with just that single handle in the middle. And off I go. This is the moment the whole build is leading up to. This is kind of a labor-intensive project, but when this part happens, you get on the board, it's floating like it's supposed to, it's handling great, it's doing everything it's supposed to do. This is the payoff. This is the magic moment of making your own paddleboard. This was a very fun project for me. I would do this again in a heartbeat. Part of what's cool about this is it's so different from furniture making or cabinet making. It's a completely different type of build, and it's just refreshing to do something like this. Perfect. Part of the premise with this video was for me to go through the experience and then let you know, how did it go? What did I learn? So let's talk about that, and I'll fill you in on how this whole thing went for me, starting with the kit. I love the Jarvis board kit. It went together very easily. The support from Jarvis is really, really good. They've got instructional videos out there, so step by step you can watch those videos and see, what do I need to do next? Where am I going with this? So I have zero problems with the kit aspect of this. Remember that. Jarvis makes way more than the board that I built. They've got a lot of different designs. So have a look at their website, and that's going to help you pick out the board that's best for you. So the kit aspect went great. Prepping strips. I love this part. I enjoyed going and picking out my material. I enjoyed cutting the material. The SawStop table saw handled this very, very, very well. Now, if you don't want to do this step, if you don't want to make your own strips, you can get the strips prepped for you. But making the strips was a cool aspect for me, because as I cut strips with both the cedar and the maple and the walnut and the bloodwood, I was starting to see what this pattern was going to look like on the board. So that, as a woodworker, is very fun for me to compose my own look for this paddleboard. But like I said, you can get strips made for you. You can buy strips if you don't want to prep them yourself. The material doesn't have to be perfectly clear, but it can't have huge knots in it. One thing I would do differently if I did this again, if you're familiar with woodworking, if you're familiar with resaw and book match, when you cut two pieces and they lived face to face, when you open them up like this, you have a book match. If I did this again, I would keep track of my strips, and I would then put this strip here and this strip here, so that working from the center out, you would have a mirror image going each way on your board. That would be very, very cool. I didn't think of that until I was too deep in to go back and do it. The other thing to keep in mind, talk to Jarvis about this, you can panelize the build, which means you can put all the strips together as a panel and then put the whole panel on. So that is a different approach to working with the strips, a different approach to making this happen. Now you've got the strips, fastening the strips. My Bessie clamps work great for this. I love the one-hand clamps because they're one-handed, so I could hold apart, manipulate the clamp. Clearly I used a lot of spring clamps on this for hold down pressure. So have a lot of clamps on hand. Slow and steady is the watchword here. You got to be patient. In my normal woodworking projects, I might glue and clamp something, and in 30 minutes, 45 minutes, take the clamps off, set the something aside, and then use the clamps for something else. With this, the Titebond 3 work great, but you really got to allow time for the glue to cure, especially when you get to where you're really forcing those strips into a curve. You got to allow ample gluing time. So I think the way Jarvis talks about this is like, do the strip glue up on a day when you've got other stuff to do, so you can put a strip on, walk away, put a strip on, walk away. When I started on the strip fastening part, I was doing one at a time because I wanted to get a feel for the process. Once I got more comfortable with it, then I was doing two, one on this side, one on this side, glue them, clamp them, and then go do other stuff. But just be prepared for that to take a while, because you're going to wait a little longer on this to remove the clamps than you might on other woodworking projects. Sanding and planing. So the Surf Prep sander had great dust collection on it. I ran the Grizzly air cleaner while I was doing that to keep my environment clean. All of that worked great. Random orbit sander and the 3x4 sander worked really, really well for smoothing this out and getting rid of whoops. The Bridge City planes were wonderful because in areas like the rails are a great example where I had a lot of material to take off. The plane is faster and it's making a shaving, not dust. So good dust collection, like I picked up from Surf Prep and Grizzly, is a must. But if you can do, the more work you can do with a hand plane, like the Bridge City planes, the better this is going to go, because you're making shavings, not dust. And like I said, you're taking material off faster. The scraper plane, to knock glue beads off, to level strips out, really was a big time saver to save me sanding time. So a little bit like putting everything together on planing and sanding, take your time. This is a very, very fun step because you start to generate the curves. And as you're developing those curves, you start to see what the paddleboard is going to look like. And that's very, very cool. That's a blast. With the epoxy, the Total Bolt products work great for this. Anytime I talk about epoxy, I say about 1 million times, read the directions, read the directions, read the directions. Customer support from Total Bolt is great. If you got a question, give them a call, read the directions. Your environment has to be good for this, meaning not too cold, not too hot. You can't have dust filtering out of the air when you're putting the epoxy on. So one thing I would do differently, if I did this again, I would get an extra pair of hands on board, pun intended, accidental pun there, to help me with the epoxy. Because there's just a lot to do. There's a lot of real estate to cover here, and it would just be a lot easier if you had another pair of hands as you're working through that. So be patient with it, follow the directions about the number of coats you need to do, the waiting time between coats, can't be too little, can't be too much. Again, follow the directions, talk to Total Bolt, they'll walk you through it. With the varnish, it's kind of the same story. The Gleam varnish handled wonderfully. The Fuji HVLP for that was a wonderful device. If you can't spray, you can brush the Gleam on. But again, read the directions, because there's information about the number of coats you can do in a day, drying time between coats, how to clean it up, obviously. So with the varnish, again, you want your environment to be right. And one thing to be aware of there is the Gleam dries slowly. So when you're doing that aspect, when you're doing that step in your shop, you can't be woodworking in your shop probably, because if you're making dust, it's going to settle in the wet varnish. So it's another aspect that's there's a lot of time involved, there's a lot of labor involved, but the end result is really good. And of course, we need the varnish to protect the epoxy. Overall, this project was a blast for me. I really learned a lot. I really enjoyed composing the look of my paddleboard, and that comes down to working with the strips and making that happen. I like that much more than the idea of going out and buying somebody else's wooden paddleboard, because this is uniquely my own. The decals are up there that I put on. That's a very cool personalization step. It's labor intensive, without question, but the result is incredible. And I've had so many people compliment the look of the board now that it's done. And you can't beat, the first time I got that on the water and I stood on that thing, and it floated and it paddled and it did what I needed it to do. That was so rewarding and worth every step of what it took to get to that point. I would say this project is not a difficult project. You probably need to be you could be an intermediate level woodworker. You got to be comfortable using tools. You got to understand woodworking processes. You need to be methodical about it and just think through A, then B, B, then C. And again, the support from Jarvis is very good on that. Like I said, it's not a difficult project, but you need to be methodical about it. When this is all done, my board weighs 45 pounds, finished. You could see in the video where I'm putting it on the water, with the handle in the middle, it carries like a suitcase. It's very easy to get it to the water, get it on the water. And paddling, it handled great. I really couldn't ask for any more. So overall, would I do this again? Yes. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I really enjoyed seeing it develop as I went. And like I said, I would say intermediate level woodworker, you don't need a boatload of tools. You need some space. I love the Jarvis idea of the concrete buckets with the pillars. That's how I would do this if I did this again, because that makes a beautiful work platform. Overall, excellent experience for me. I really enjoyed this, and I'd love to see your board when you're done.